The cameras were already waiting before dawn. Reporters crowded the runway. Military officers moved in silence. And somewhere inside the White House, the pressure surrounding President Donald Trump had reached a level few American presidents had faced in recent years. Because as Air Force One prepared for takeoff toward Beijing, the world was no longer asking whether the Iran crisis was dangerous. The world was asking how close it was to exploding into something far bigger. Across the Middle East, tensions were spiraling out of control. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil routes on Earth, had become the center of global fear. Oil prices were rising. Financial markets were shaking. Military forces were moving across the region. Israel had intensified operations in Lebanon. American naval forces expanded their presence near Iranian waters. And intelligence agencies warned that one single miscalculation could ignite a regional war capable of dragging multiple world powers into direct confrontation. But while the world focused on Tehran, another city suddenly became the center of global attention: Beijing. Trump's emergency-style trip to China was no ordinary diplomatic visit. It was the first American presidential visit to China in nearly a decade, arriving at one of the most unstable geopolitical moments in years. Xi Jinping was preparing to welcome Trump behind heavily guarded doors while analysts around the world tried to understand the real reason behind the mission. Officially, both sides spoke about trade, tariffs, economic cooperation, and regional stability. But behind the diplomatic language, one issue overshadowed everything else: Iran. The Guardian: China had quietly become one of the most important players in the Iran crisis. Beijing remained one of Tehran's largest economic lifelines, especially through oil purchases and strategic partnerships. American officials openly acknowledged that China held enormous leverage over Iran's economy and future decisions. The Wall Street Journal, too, that reality changed the entire balance of power. Trump understood that military pressure alone might not be enough to force Tehran into submission. China's influence now mattered more than ever. And suddenly, the fate of the Middle East appeared connected to conversations about to happen thousands of miles away inside Beijing. As Trump departed Washington, he attempted to project confidence. He told reporters that America did not need China's help to handle Iran, but he also admitted he planned to discuss the conflict extensively with Xi during the summit. Reuters: that contradiction revealed the pressure surrounding the trip. Publicly, Trump wanted to appear strong and independent. Privately, the geopolitical reality was far more complicated. China controlled economic relationships America could not ignore. Nearly every major global power understood that if Beijing chose to pressure Tehran economically, the balance of the conflict could change rapidly. But there was another side to the crisis few ordinary people fully understood. The Iran conflict was not only a military danger. It was becoming an economic earthquake. Every threat to the Strait of Hormuz sent fear through global markets because nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through those waters. Analysts warned that a prolonged conflict could trigger fuel shortages, inflation spikes, shipping disruptions, and financial instability across multiple continents. ABC News: and this is where China became impossible to ignore. Beijing depended heavily on Middle Eastern energy supplies. China also remained one of the largest buyers of Iranian oil. If the region collapsed into total chaos, China's economy could suffer severe consequences alongside the United States and Europe. That created a strange reality where Washington and Beijing, despite years of rivalry, sanctions, and trade wars, suddenly shared a dangerous common interest: preventing the Iran crisis from spiraling completely out of control. But the deeper Trump traveled into this diplomatic mission, the more complicated the situation became. China was not simply an innocent observer. American intelligence officials and analysts increasingly suspected that Chinese companies and networks had helped Iran strengthen parts of its military and surveillance capabilities during the conflict. Wikipedia: Beijing denied those accusations, but distrust between both superpowers continued growing behind the scenes. That meant every handshake between Trump and Xi carried hidden tension beneath the public smiles. The stakes extended far beyond Iran alone. Taiwan, trade disputes, AI competition, semiconductor restrictions, sanctions, military alliances, every major global issue was now connected to this summit. Trump arrived in Beijing not only as an American president facing a Middle East crisis, but as a leader trying to stop global instability from damaging Amr. As the United States, China, Iran, and Israel moved deeper into one of the most dangerous geopolitical crises in recent years, another global power was watching everything very carefully from the shadows. Russia. While headlines focused on Donald Trump's emergency diplomacy in Beijing and rising fears surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, the Kremlin quietly studied every development with strategic patience. Because inside Moscow, many officials believed the Iran crisis was not only reshaping the Middle East, it was accelerating a much larger global power shift that could redefine international politics for years to come. And according to growing fears among Western analysts, Russia may be one of the biggest long-term beneficiaries of the entire confrontation. President Vladimir Putin understood something critical about the Iran crisis from the very beginning. The deeper America became trapped inside another unstable Middle Eastern conflict, the more difficult it would become for Washington to focus on challenging Russia and China elsewhere around the world. Every military deployment to the Gulf required resources. Every diplomatic emergency consumed political attention. Every economic shock weakened Western unity further. And from Moscow's perspective, prolonged instability between the United States and Iran created opportunities Russia could quietly exploit without directly entering the conflict itself. One of the biggest advantages for Russia came through energy markets. As tensions around the Strait of Hormuz pushed oil prices sharply higher, Moscow's economy immediately benefited. Russia remains one of the world's largest energy exporters, and rising global oil prices strengthened Kremlin revenues dramatically. Reuters.com, https://www.reuters.com/world-Russia-oil-war-2026-05-12/?, Analysts noted that every new escalation in the Gulf indirectly helped Russia financially while simultaneously increasing inflation pressure on Western economies. This created a dangerous geopolitical paradox where instability hurting America and Europe often improved Russia's economic position at the exact same time. But Moscow's interests went far beyond oil profits alone. Russia had spent years building strategic relationships with both Iran and China as part of a broader effort to challenge Western dominance globally. Tehran and Moscow cooperated closely in Syria for years. Russia supplied military technology, diplomatic support, and economic coordination to Iran during periods of Western sanctions. Meanwhile, China and Russia continued strengthening economic and geopolitical cooperation through trade partnerships, military exercises, and opposition to what both governments described as American unilateralism. TheGuardian.com, https://www.theguardian.com/world/2026/May/10/Russia-Iran-China-alliance-global-order-analysis?mark-UTM_source=sign ChatGPT.com, that meant the Iran crisis was not simply a regional conflict anymore. It was becoming part of a larger global alignment involving multiple powers challenging American influence simultaneously. Inside Moscow, officials reportedly viewed Trump's trip to Beijing with deep interest. The Kremlin understood that Washington now needed China's cooperation to stabilize the Iran situation. That reality alone represented a major shift in global power dynamics. For decades, the United States often acted as the dominant force shaping Middle Eastern outcomes. But now, American diplomacy depended heavily on Beijing's economic leverage over Tehran. Russia saw this as evidence that the international system was gradually becoming more multipolar, a world where Washington could no longer dictate outcomes alone. And from Putin's perspective, that transformation worked strongly in Moscow's favor. European governments also became increasingly nervous as the crisis expanded. Rising energy prices and geopolitical instability exposed how vulnerable Europe remained during major global confrontations. Some European leaders privately worried that America's growing focus on Iran could weaken long-term Western coordination on Ukraine, NATO strategy, and broader security issues involving Russia. BBC.com, https://www.bbc.com/news/world-europe-688543221?mark UTM_source=chatgpt.com. Moscow understood these fears perfectly. The more divided and distracted the West became, the greater Russia's strategic flexibility grew across multiple regions simultaneously. Meanwhile, reports emerged suggesting Russia quietly increased diplomatic coordination with Tehran during the crisis. While Moscow publicly called for de-escalation and negotiations, intelligence analysts believed the Kremlin had little interest in seeing American influence strengthened through a successful resolution led entirely by Washington. Instead, Russia preferred a carefully balanced situation where instability weakened Western unity without escalating into uncontrollable global war. As the world focused on the high-stakes diplomacy unfolding in Beijing between President Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, another crisis was quietly intensifying hundreds of miles away inside Israel. Behind closed doors in Tel Aviv, Israeli military commanders, intelligence chiefs, and political leaders were preparing for a possibility many feared could change the entire Middle East overnight. Because while global powers debated sanctions, oil routes, and negotiations with Tehran, Israel believed time might already be running out. And according to growing fears inside the Israeli security establishment, Iran could be using diplomacy not to avoid conflict, but to prepare for a larger confrontation still to come. Inside Israel, the mood had shifted dramatically in recent weeks. Emergency security meetings became more frequent. Military readiness levels increased near Lebanon and Syria. Air defense systems expanded across major cities. Intelligence agencies warned that Iran-backed forces across the region were becoming more active as tensions with Washington escalated. TimesOfIsrael.com, https://www.timesofisrael.com/liveblog-may-13-2026, Israeli officials feared the crisis was entering a far more dangerous phase where multiple fronts could ignite simultaneously. Hezbollah forces in southern Lebanon remained one of Israel's biggest concerns. The group possessed tens of thousands of rockets capable of reaching deep inside Israeli territory, and recent clashes near the border intensified fears that another large-scale war could erupt with very little warning. According to Israeli intelligence assessments, Hezbollah had increased operational readiness while closely coordinating with Tehran as the regional crisis expanded. jpost.com, https://www.jpost.com/middle-east/article-805913. This created enormous pressure on Israeli leadership. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and senior defense officials reportedly feared that Iran's strategy involved dragging Israel into prolonged regional chaos while avoiding direct full-scale confrontation with the United States itself. From Israel's perspective, the danger was not only Iran's nuclear ambitions or naval threats inside Hormuz. The greater fear involved Iran's growing network of regional allies and militias positioned around Israeli borders. Hezbollah in Lebanon. Militias in Syria and Iraq. Armed groups connected to Tehran across the wider region. Israeli planners believed Iran had spent years building what they described as a ring of fire surrounding Israel strategically. CNN.com, https://edition.cnn.com/2026/05/12/middle-east/israel-iran-border-war-index.html, and now, with global tensions rising rapidly, many inside Israel worried those networks could soon become active on a much larger scale. Civilians inside Israel also began preparing psychologically for escalation. Air raid drills expanded in northern cities. Emergency response teams reviewed wartime procedures. Families near the Lebanese border discussed evacuation plans openly as media coverage intensified fears of retaliation. Israeli television networks showed constant updates about regional military developments while political commentators debated whether diplomacy with Tehran had any realistic chance of succeeding. Across social media and public discussion, one question kept appearing repeatedly: if negotiations fail, what will Israel do next? The pressure on Trump from pro-Israel allies in Washington also continued growing. Influential political figures and security hawks argued that Iran was only using diplomacy to buy time while strengthening its military position regionally. Some American officials feared Beijing's involvement could actually slow Western pressure on Tehran instead of increasing it. Behind the scenes, Israeli officials reportedly urged Washington not to trust Iranian promises too quickly. FoxNews.com, https://www.foxnews.com/world/Israel-warns-over-Iran-negotiations-China-role. They believe Tehran's leadership remained fundamentally committed to expanding regional influence regardless of temporary negotiations or ceasefire discussions. This created enormous tension between military urgency and diplomatic caution. Trump wanted stability to calm markets and avoid a wider war, especially while negotiating with Xi Jinping. But Israeli leadership increasingly feared that delaying decisive action could allow Iran and Hezbollah to become even stronger. Rumors of possible Israeli military operations began circulating quietly through diplomatic and intelligence circles. Analysts speculated about potential airstrikes targeting Hezbollah infrastructure, Iranian-linked facilities in Syria, or even more aggressive operations designed to weaken Tehran's regional network directly. Israeli officials publicly refused to confirm such plans, but military movements near northern borders fueled growing speculation that contingency preparations were already underway. That balance was extremely dangerous because it meant several major powers now viewed the crisis not only through security concerns, but through long-term strategic competition as well. The deeper the conflict evolved, the clearer it became that global alliances themselves were shifting. Countries across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East increasingly saw China and Russia positioning themselves as alternatives to traditional American leadership. Iran openly embraced closer ties with both Beijing and Moscow during the crisis, arguing that Western sanctions and military pressure proved the need for a new international order less dominated by Washington. AlJazeera.com. And while many nations still relied heavily on American economic and military power, the perception of global balance was beginning to change rapidly. Technology competition, trade wars, sanctions, energy politics, and military alliances were all becoming interconnected parts of one larger geopolitical transformation. Putin's strategy throughout the crisis reflected patience rather than urgency. Moscow avoided direct military involvement while carefully benefiting from the instability surrounding Western rivals. Russian media increasingly portrayed the Iran confrontation as proof that America's global dominance was weakening under the pressure of endless geopolitical conflicts. Meanwhile, Kremlin officials emphasized diplomacy publicly while continuing to strengthen ties with governments opposing Western influence. What frightened many analysts most was the possibility that the Iran crisis could accelerate the formation of rival geopolitical blocs around the world. One centered around the United States and traditional Western allies. Another increasingly influenced by China, Russia, Iran, and countries seeking alternatives to Western-led systems. If that division deepened, the consequences could extend far beyond the Middle East itself. Trade systems, energy markets, military partnerships, financial institutions, and global diplomacy could all become more fragmented and confrontational over time. And this is why Russia watched the Iran crisis so carefully. Because from Moscow's perspective, the confrontation was not only about Tehran, Israel, or Hormuz anymore. It was about the future balance of global power itself. Every diplomatic struggle between Trump and Xi. Every economic shock hitting Western economies. Every sign of division among American allies. All of it signaled a world slowly moving toward a new and more unstable geopolitical era. And inside the Kremlin, many believed that transformation had already begun.